Welcome to A Moment of Bach, where we take our favorite moments from the composer's vast musical output, just a minute's worth or even a few seconds, and show you why we think they are remarkable. We are your hosts, Alex and Christian Giebert. Today's moment is from the Et Resurrexit movement of the Mass in B minor. Some artists are subjective, some objective. The art of the former has its source in their personality. Their work is almost independent of the epoch in which they live. A law unto themselves, they place themselves in opposition to their epoch and originate new forms for the expression of their ideas. Of this type was Richard Wagner. Bach belongs to the order of objective artists. These are wholly of their own time and work only with the forms and the ideas that their time proffers them. In them, the artistic personality exists independently of the human, the latter remaining in the background as if it were something almost accidental. Bach, indeed, is clearly not a single but a universal personality. Whatever path we traverse through the poetry and the music of the Middle Ages, we are always led to him. That quote comes from Schweitzer's J.S. Bach volume, and I think nowhere else is it more perfectly encapsulated than the Mass in B minor, which is itself a collection of various Baroque forms and Bach's own earlier works. It's almost something that could only exist by a composer that Schweitzer calls objective, not trying to make their mark on history, but just by necessity pulling from every historical form that came before the composer into one gigantic whole thing. And this is the thing, the Mass in B minor, a giant religious text, hundreds of years of church music history bound up in it, and then 150 200 years of instrumental technique and developments and influences from around Europe shining forth through it. But also the storytelling device that Bach had in the Baroque era being shown in it, which is not something, like we talked about last week, Alex, that was always true of the older medieval and Renaissance music. Right. The storytelling device of text setting was not there, and Bach is a text painter. And the Creed, the Nicene Creed, the I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, so on and so forth, is a huge chunk of not incredibly lyrical text that has to be divided into a bunch of separate chunks in order to make each of those divisions musically and tonally different with their own character or tone. Right. When we talked of affect in the last... We talked about it in a couple of previous episodes recently. That's why you need such a huge, over 2 hour long work as the Mass in B minor, because he needs to split up all these things into these movements so that each one can have its own affect or vibe or tone or feeling. And you got to have that. I mean, we just looked at last week the Crucifixus, right? We looked at that because it was Holy Week. The affect of that was Holy Week, right? It was about Jesus' death.
the stunning, absolutely mind-boggling contrast between that and it's resurrexit. I can't imagine what it must have been like to hear this back in Bach's day.
Rarely do two pieces in order tonally contrast against each other as much as these two.
Yeah.
Bach's Mass in B minor is incredibly spread out. Renaissance masses and older masses, they blow through this section quickly. You don't even know necessarily that there is a tonal shift between these parts, but it all leads to Bach and his idea of segmenting this into this many parts and making each one have its own affect and translating it into his Baroque style. Listener, just let this play out for a minute and dwell upon the words that we're hearing here at the end of the Crucifixus. He suffered and was buried, and thus ends that movement. But after a short moment of silence, and on the third day he rose again, according to the scriptures. Really is quite objective, even if you are a sort of postmodern thinker. It's kind of hard to deny that there's some kind of objectivity to the way this all comes together and becomes one thing in its highest form. Because there is not a drop of ego in this.
Yeah.
It's completely in service to its text. Everything is in service to its text. All of Bach's instrumental writing, all of the festive trumpets and timpani, all of the flutes, oboes, strings, and joyful choir. It's all about presenting and expressing the text. And on the third day he rose again according to the scriptures and ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father, and he shall come again with glory to judge both the living and the dead, whose kingdom shall have no end.
That's true. And Christian, you can't be this objective anymore with music, because we've exploded out into just all these different styles, in Western classical music, but in a bunch of other styles. But basically, like Schweitzer's point of Bach being a terminal point of music to that era, like that's not possible anymore, I don't think, because we're too fragmented. And in a way, that's a beautiful thing. I mean, I'm not saying that's bad. And also, we have to admit that Schweitzer is talking about a specific thing too, right? Which is Western classical music. And that's the lens through which he's seeing this. However, with that lens on, it's hard to argue that point. That Bach is this terminal point. That the expression of this stuff is as close to a collective soul that you could have of a culture.
Yeah, basically of European Western music and religious thought.
Right, and I guess my point is, it's when something hits the zeitgeist just right, like, let's say the rock and roll like craze, right? Or like the Beatles or whatever, right? It does so for a reason. But the thing about that is, even though these crazes of the 20th century may have been huge, they also like usually only affected younger generations. It's a little bit different, you know, that everything is a lot more compressed in time with the advent of all these different communication technologies, and even just a little earlier than that, the Industrial Revolution. And it's just too complicated to get into all this stuff. But the point is that you can't have another Bach anymore, because we're too far in history for that, you know?
He did exist at a terminal point in history, and everything before him in Western music led to him. Almost everything. There may be a few threads here and there that didn't, but they mostly did.
Yeah.
At least in Western Europe. And then after him, what's left is the humanistic serving of new thought for its own sake. Or the Romantic era of exploring oneself, which comes 100 or so years later.
Yeah, but the roots of which were in the Enlightenment, right? I mean, and the other thing too is to note about that is that it's not just that Bach was in the right time at the right place, so to speak, but he also had to have the right character of personality to be the culmination of all these styles and to treat them with the sort of reverence that he did. Because Schweitzer makes a good point later in the book about Handel. Handel is undoubtedly a great composer, but he definitely didn't care as much about all that stuff as Bach, like the old chorale melodies, for example. Yeah. Did Handel care about the old chorale melodies? Not really, by judging what he wrote, right? Mm-hmm. So that makes Handel's work a little bit more, I guess, subjective would be the way Schweitzer would call it, but it's not a culmination, right? It's its own thing.
And John Eliot Gardner talks about this too in his book. We don't know a great deal about Bach's own personal life. He didn't write that much down. We don't have as many personal letters. And if we did, we might find that to be disappointing anyway. But since we don't, it just goes to show that that is not a part of what makes this music at the level that it is. And in fact, anything we do have, which is just mostly record keeping, shows a man who was, I guess, just not as enigmatically interesting as you would expect him to be.
Right.
For a person who produced music of this consistency and greatness.
Right. It's almost as if he had to spring up out of the collective cultural consciousness of Western music, and particularly German Western music. And that is really Schweitzer's thesis statement of the book, at least of the beginning portions of the book, about the history preceding Bach's life. And one quote that I love is this, which we've already referenced. Bach is a terminal point. Nothing comes from him. Everything merely leads up to him. To give his true biography is to exhibit the nature and the unfolding of German art that comes to completion in him and is exhausted in him, to comprehend it in all its strivings and its failures. This genius was not an individual, but a collective soul.
Yeah, you might be thinking, listener, like, well, a lot of stuff comes from Bach. Aren't most composers influenced by him in the Western tradition? Yes, but he's so bound up with the idea of what music became that to study Bach is just to study a very high form of art. It is very impersonal and unattached to his humanity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's almost like if he had bound up his own personality or humanity into his music, then it wouldn't have been this anymore. It's kind of like the Sorcerer's Stone, from the first Harry Potter book. He had to not want to use it
Oh, right. Yeah.
and then it magically became in his possession. Bach had to not take credit for a lot of this stuff in the way that a Richard Wagner was obsessed with taking credit over his own inventions.
Yeah, or like in The West Wing, where Toby saved Social Security, but the only way he can save it is by not getting to take credit for it, right? Doesn't that happen? Am I imagining that?
Yeah, I don't remember how it happens, but
Yeah.
the gist of it is that they work out a way to fix the whole thing for the country, but the catch is that no one will ever
No, they
no
didn't.
one will ever know that they helped.
Or another analogy for that is like the Sorcerer's Stone thing, where it's like, to be a great leader, you have to not want to be a great leader. Like, at least not for the wrong reasons, right? Which is reasons of ego or power.
There's also something just inherently bound up in the story of Christ's death and resurrection that makes it so that if you were to put your own personal egotistical spin on this, I don't see how it would work.
That's a great point.
And maybe that's why church music is austere in a stuffy way, even negatively, and in a good way, in the best possible way. It's like Bach, where it's just incredibly passionate and honors its text.
Right.
But it can also be, it could just also be come across as stuffy or cheesy in more modern church music.
Sure. What if something is hymn-like and presents a objective statement of faith, it can feel stuffy. If something is subjective and presents an emotional response to a religious truth, then it can feel artificial. So there's two differences there. There's a dichotomy there of style, right, and of the effectiveness of each of those styles.
It's something that you and I, Alex, face all the time as church musicians, because we have to work in multiple styles, and you've got those two things against each other.
You do, and you also have a lot of very strong viewpoints about it coming from a lot of different people, which ultimately leads me to my next point, which is that people care a lot about music, like in general, especially in church, or music that has to do with religious things. And for Bach's music to so perfectly encapsulate the soul of the culture that he sprung out of, that is why we're talking the way we are about him, right? If he was just some composer who put his own stamp on something and he had a unique, interesting, and quirky take on these religious themes, right? Then he would be of passing interest to future generations and may just have been forgotten.
Yeah.
But it's not like that.
And the way he synthesized all the old and new. I mean, this church music thing is a constant source of gripe and sometimes misunderstanding by some people. A man lamented to me, we've lost the music war in church music, because instead of the organ, now we have the drums and the guitars and stuff. And it made me think, well, that's not how I see it at all. It's a matter of instrumentation, and it doesn't have to be all about style. It doesn't have to mean like rock and roll. It doesn't have to mean that. And also, I found a way to try to politely point out to this guy that, this is how it's been for 1,000 years. In the year 1100 or so, the taboo, horrible, flashy new thing to do that was considered wildly inappropriate for the church by a lot of people was harmony. Singing in parts, more than one.
Yeah.
Like a choir, which seems ridiculous to say now, but it was. And it's always been that way. And then it was instruments.
Yeah.
And then it's always something.
Because, and there's always a good reason, right? A justification for that view. It's that harmony distracts from the oneness of the unity of the church.
Yeah.
Because you're splitting the parts up. Same thing with instruments. Oh, instruments are just kind of there for their own glory. They're not
Flashy.
really singing the words, the scripture, or right.
But
the parts of the service.
The drum set is a vile and like rhythmic thing that suggests dance, which is secular and not
or
and
because it
non-religious.
comes from rock and roll, which is secular.
Yeah. And yet we know from the benefit of history that these things all eventually make their way into music of all types, including religious music.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing about the Mass in B minor. We are now going from Holy Week, Good Friday, Jesus' death, where Bach employs an old stylistic device, the ground bass, the Passacaglia. He puts his spin on it, but it is in some ways kind of ancient.
Yeah.
And especially in certain moments like your chosen moment last week, Alex. Ancient moments pushing forward, and then all of a sudden this beautiful festive dance in 3/4 time at Resurrexit, as we celebrate the festival of Easter, of Christ's resurrection, which is a thing that doesn't even happen in Bach's Passion music. This is actually going through the church year and moving forward onto finishing the story. And for this critical turning point in the Mass in B minor, from death to life, Bach uses old and new musical styles, which just proves that Bach is not in it to promote some sort of composerly theory or style or anything. He's just using everything that's came before him. Mm-hmm. He's using it to his advantage, all in the service of setting the text about the story of the gospel, which is what his strength was, and it's why this music endures to this day. And the masterstroke of starting with the words. The Mass in B minor starts with words without an introduction. It's not like this is the only time it happens, but typically you'd expect an instrumental introduction, comes back as a refrain, and the Et Resurrexit ends with that. But it starts with that 1 and 2, bum, 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 bum. And it has that rhythm, that 3-note pickup rhythm that ascends and jumps up really fast. And it's just so exciting.
It rises, yeah.
We talk sometimes a little bit about the particulars of the performance that we're using. And in this case, the Netherlands Bach Society makes a wonderful performance decision, I think, in that in the entire Mass in B minor, they use soloists for a lot of the key moments, where it doesn't necessarily have an indication whether or not to do this. We didn't mention this last week, Alex, but the Crucifixus, the entire thing is done with 4 soloists.
Yeah.
That is a bold decision. Not very many recordings have that. There are a few. Petit Band has one where it's all soloists. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And they use period instruments. Maybe Bach was envisioning a smaller choir, and it can be done this way.
Well, certainly he wasn't envisioning a large choir, because we know that based on how many parts he prepared.
Oh, cool. Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's only 8
so,
total, which means that some of the parts on the 5-part stuff were not doubled at all.
Imagine how good those singers were.
Yeah.
So this makes a lot of sense, but it's so powerful the way they do it, where he's got soloists for the entire Crucifixus, and then they sink deeper and deeper into He Was Buried, and then that remarkable contrast into and on the 3rd day he rose again. The first word is there's et, and then resurrexit, he rose again. The Netherlands Bach Society uses suddenly the full choir and orchestra, and the use of the full choir contrasted from before the use of the soloists is just remarkable in it. It's not something you see in most Mass in B minor recordings. You can find plenty of recordings of the Mass in B minor, but this is pretty unusual, and it's kind of a stroke of genius, if you ask me, about how the way they did this concert.
Yeah.
And we know that if you've been a listener for a while, episode 4, first season, Magnificat, the trumpets and timpani are employed only in instances of great festivity. Got here 3 trumpets and timpani. They're in a fixed sort of key, which is why we are in the very traditionally rejoicing key of D major, which is also why Bach had to set us up for that at the end of the Crucifixus. The whole thing leads up. The Crucifixus leads down, down, down into this strange place, setting us up a little bit closer to where we're about to go, but it leaves it a little ambiguous as we await 3 days, I guess, for Christ to rise from the dead until it happens in this joyous dance. Quick highlights, though, besides the very beginning. I mean, you can't top the first 1 second of this, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's got to be...
That's the moment.
Yeah.
But quick 2 highlights on top of that. There's a part for the basses, often sung by the bass section of the choir. Et iterum venturus est cum gloria judicare vivos et mortuos, which is, and he shall come again with glory to judge both the quick and the dead. It's this great moment where just the basses sing, but in this performance it's given to a soloist. And this makes a whole lot of sense because this is a little bit like the way Bach uses the bass voice in the cantatas as the voice of Christ. Now, this is not literally Christ because he's using the word he, but he's saying, and Christ shall come again with glory to judge both the quick and the dead. And so in a way, you could imagine that that is Christ saying, and I will come back to judge both the living and the dead. And here the Netherlands Bach Society used a soloist for that, and that's interesting and not done in all performances of this piece.
Et iterum venturus est cum gloria, venturus est cum gloria, judicare vivos et mortuos, judicare vivos et mortuos, vivos et mortuos.
It also just makes sense logically because there's less going on in the texture of the orchestration. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like those moments in some of the cantatas where it's only continuo, right? Although here there are actually 3 string parts playing short notes, but they're soft.
Yeah. And then our last bonus moment is, Alex, you pointed out, there is a bass line,
the continuo line,
where it builds in tension and it goes up chromatically and it tops out on a B and then finally lands on an E. And this is kind of the opposite. It's kind of the reverse of the Crucifixus bass line.
I just noticed this, in preparation for this tonight. It wasn't something that I've really keyed into before. But with Bach, these kind of things aren't accidents.
Yeah, the Crucifixus, it goes from E chromatically down to B all the way, and then back to E. This one starts a little lower than B and then moves chromatically up 3 notes to B, and then lands on E before finally snaking back around to A and then finally D, where it belongs. So it's almost like this is the completion of the arc that was that whole other thing.
Yeah, and I mean, not for nothing, the voice parts are also slowly and steadily ascending during this section and reaching a triumphant peak, right? And all of this is on purpose. I firmly believe that. I know Bach well enough now to say that.
He was so precise in the way he wrote this music. The whole thing is really, truly a historical culmination of all of the music that has ever been written on this religious Latin text. The way he drew from the past, Bach was a terminal point. It was all leading up to him.
And now, here is the opening of Et Resurrexit. If this introduction to a musical moment has inspired you to hear the rest of the Mass in B minor, please see the link in the episode description to see its performance by the Netherlands Bach Society. Do you want to hear our new episodes as we release them? Find us on your podcast app and hit subscribe. If you like the podcast, please find us on iTunes and give us a rating. That really helps other people find the podcast.
And tell us what your favorite moment is from the Mass in B minor if you're someone who knows that work. Surely we've got some people who love it out there. Tell us what your favorite moment is. We'll come back to them eventually. Although next week, Alex, what will we be doing?
Next week, we will be looking at the Bach double, which is a colloquial term for the Concerto for Two Violins in D minor, BWV 1043.
Until next time, enjoy those moments.